In our next example, I would like to analyze Mars Dasha. So let's start with the D1 for Virgo rising. Mars rules the evil 3rd house and the destructive 8th house and is therefore the most inauspicious house lord. Mars also rules Saturn, who is the 6th lord, and the Sun, who is the 12th lord. And so in Mars Dasha, all of the primary Dushtana houses get activated, with the 8th house being the most evil and destructive. Overall though, the D1 doesn't look bad at all. Right? They got Jupiter, the Sun, and the Moon in great dignity. Mercury, Venus also form an auspicious 9-10 interchange. Mercury is the Lagna Lord and placed in the auspicious 9th house. Right? The Sun here is also the Atma Karaka and exalted, and so one might think at first glance that they're going to have a really great life. However, they were 20 years old when Mars Dasha started, and we've just seen that Mars triggers all of the inauspicious houses, and therefore in Mars Dasha the person might actually experience obstacles and delay because of the 6th house, or crisis and distraction with the 8th house involvement here, or even losses and expenses due to the 12th house also getting triggered in Mars Dasha. And those difficulties can be more severe if there's some bad karma indicated in the D40 that's passed down through the mother side. So let's have a look at the D40 and find out. And we can see here that Mars is debilitated and it rules the important 4th cusp. Mars also rules Rahu and Ketu, who are similarly debilitated. Mars is also conjunct the 8th cusp, and that makes things worse. Now, Mars rules in total 4 houses and is conjunct 2, and they all get afflicted more severely during Mars Dasha. Right? The 2nd and 8th house rule personal and shared finances, the 4th house home and happiness, the 10th house status and reputation, the 9th house higher education, and the 3rd house communication. And so Mars will create inauspiciousness in those areas during its Dasha. Now, depending on the individual Varga, it will be more or less. Interestingly enough, Mars is aspected by all 3 manifestors, Mercury, Jupiter, and its Lord Moon, who is even in Mula Trikona dignity. And yet, we will see that the dignity of the Dasha Lord in the D40 is very powerful and important, more so than the aspects of other planets. When a planet is debilitated in the D40, right away we know that the Mahadasha will be tragic in some way. On the other hand, if a planet is in own or exaltation dignity, then the Mahadasha will be one of the best periods in a person's life. So now let's head over to the D1 and see what actually happened in Mars Dasha. So Mars is the 8th lord of other people's money, and it is placed here in the 9th house of higher education. And this person in Mars Dasha got a full scholarship at a prestigious university. However, Mars in the D40 is afflicted. Mars rules the 9th house of university education, and it is conjunct the 8th house of scholarship, but it is debilitated. And even though Mars in the D1 gave them a scholarship, Mars in the D40 ruined it all, and they lost it not even a year after they got it. So what exactly happened? Well, Mars is connected to the 12th house, which has to do with escapism and self-undoing. Mars is the 8th lord, and the 8th house, of course, deals with crisis and destruction. And so this person lost their path and direction. and dropped out of university. They eventually became homeless and lived on the streets. Right? Mars Dasha completely turned their life upside down, and this is really the power of the D40, right? And therefore, it's so important to have a quick look whenever you read a horoscope. Debilitated planets in the D40 can cause a huge amount of struggle in a person's life. Again, only in the Mahadasha you can ignore the Antardashas in the D40. And so in Mars Dasha, the person hit the lowest point in their life. They ended up working as a male prostitute to pay not only for food, but also their drug addiction. They lost complete control over their life. And so if you see the Dasha of the 8th Lord in the D1, and the same planet is debilitated in the D40, then the psychological weaknesses can quickly get out of control and turn the person's life into a huge tragedy. It is the 4th house in the D40 that rules our foundation and emotional stability, upon which the rest of our life is built. And when this inner stability gets debilitated and uprooted, and the person runs a tough dasha in the D1, which in this case is an 8th house dasha, then we can see how disastrous life can become. Now Mars not only debilitates the 4th house in the D40, but also Cancer, which is the sign of the moon, who is the important karak of the D40. And now Mars Dasha becomes really inauspicious, and this didn't just affect his home life and how he felt, but created a baseline of instability across his whole life, right? It affected his education, his professional life, relationships, his sense of purpose, right? And Mars Dasha basically causes life to fall apart. So now let's talk about his relationship during Mars Dasha. An important event happened there. We can see that Saturn rules the 5th house of romance, but also the 6th house of legal matters. And during Mars Dasha, he received a settlement money after suing his university counselor. Right? His counselor started an affair with him, which didn't end well. The counselor eventually realized that she could lose her job if anybody found out. And this person here took advantage of the situation and exposed her and sued her in court and won the case. Let's also have a look at the D2 and his finances. And we see a similar picture. Mars again is the 8th lord of settlement money, and it's manifested by Mercury in the 9th house of the university counselor. The other thing that's important, Mars gets aspected here by a debilitated Sun. And he struggled financially all throughout Mars Dasha. Mars rules the important 2nd house factor, namely the 3rd house. Mars also rules the destructive 8th house, the evil 6th lord Saturn, and it is aspected by the debilitated 12th lord Sun. And so he wasted a ton of money on drugs and was basically poor living on the street in Mars Dasha. Now, when we only look at the D2, we might not actually expect this. We can see that Mars is in the auspicious 9th house. It gets manifested by Mercury. It's conjunct the important Karaka moon, who is in Mula Trikona dignity. And that's why it's so important to always include the D40 in your analysis. This person also has the alcohol addiction yoga in the D1. Right? The 3rd house is in Scorpio and it is ruled by Mars. And Venus is afflicted by Rahu, and this gave them the tendency towards alcohol and drug abuse. And so for the remainder of Mars Dasha, he could not change his lifestyle and struggled making ends meet. At times he was trying to get off drugs, but then quickly relapsed. And so this Mars here in Cancer in the D40 made it very hard for him, and he weakened to the point of losing all self-control and wasn't able to do anything meaningful and productive until the end of Mars Dasha.